Good evening to all of you and the Women's Cell and the Department of English, Barabazar Bikram Tudu Memorial College that is located in Purulia, West Bengal, India. Welcome you all to this week-long international level faculty development program on gender sensitization. Now, before moving to the sessions of this seventh and final day, I'm requesting all the participants listening on the other side of this platform or on YouTube Live to remember only 2 points. And at the same time, I am overwhelmed to witness such a huge response on your side. Thanks a lot for being there for this for this 6 days, and thanks a lot for enduring all the sessions, for giving the feedback, for sending the queries, and for sitting there for 3 long hours every day. You all must be tired, like I am also. And so please, and at the same time, in the final day, don't ask for the assignment from the very beginning. It will be there in the live in the chat box. And we are here to enrich ourselves. We hope we have enriched ourselves, and we are there to sensitize our thoughts and actions. And the assignment, that the link I will provide today, you all have to submit it by tomorrow 10 a.m. And those who will be able to submit the assignment for this final day will get the certificate at first. It means it is mandatory to send the assignment of this final day, fill in the form this final. And I hope that you all have enjoyed yesterday's sessions, and I am sure that today also we all going to be enriched and also will get to know the picture of India, South Asia, and USA in general. So today we have with us three eminent speakers, namely Dr. Nidhi Vert, Assistant Professor, Department of English, University of Delhi, India. Dr. Swati Krishna, is Assistant Professor in English Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roper, and Professor Gita Patel. She is from USA. And these three speakers from three different regions, rather geographical locations, prove that we, the academicians, don't believe in any kind of border narratives among us, and we are happy to collaborate academically for our collective betterment, for giving more strength to our academic fraternity, and for raising our voice for men, women, and LGBT communities whenever it's needed. Now, taking a cue from the talks delivered by other speakers for this FDP, it means I am taking a cue from all the 20 speakers. Till now, 20 speakers have delivered their talk. We have come across the fact that gender equality is a global priority for not only India, not only Pakistan, not only for South Asia, but UNESCO in general. And inexplicably, it is linked to its effort to promote the right to education and support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, that is SDG. And through the education, taking in mind the framework of 2030 for action, SDG aims to not only ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. At the same time, it's to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. The Education 2030 agenda recognizes that gender equality requires an approach that ensures the girls and boys, women and men not only to gain access to and complete educational cycles, but are empowered equally in and through education. Large gender gaps, often at the expense of girls, although in some regions boys are at a disadvantaged condition. Despite progress, more girls than boys are still remain out of the school, and the survey said that 16 million girls will never set foot in a classroom, and women account for the two-thirds and almost of the 750 million adults without basic literary skills. Can we think that so many people are there who are not getting the basic primary needs? Poverty, geographical isolation, minority status, disability, early marriage and pregnancy, gender based violence, and traditional attitudes about the status and role of the women are among the many obstacles that stand in the way of women and girls are fully exercising their rights to participate. At the same time, how to improve gender equality in the workplace? It is reached Google's top 5 searches, around gender equality in the last year. Women have tremendous potential to transform our economy, societies, and business. And taking this short note as the food for today's first talk, let me invite our first speaker, Dr. Nidhi Vert, who works as an assistant professor at the Department of English, University of Delhi, and um, her publication includes two books and various research papers and chapters contributions are in her credit. Her areas of interest are Indian English literature, Indian mythology, language studies, and folklore studies. Now, I am requesting Dr. Watts to begin her much awaited talk, and the dais is all yours now.
Thank you for your kind words, Dr. Karmakar, and thank you for having me here. I have been following the FDP and I really appreciate this great initiative. So, the title of my today's talk, or whatever I'm going to express in front of you, you already know that is gender equality in education and workplace. Who needs to be empowered and why? Basically, we all know that. So, I'll start it with a quote. Perhaps we all are from literature, so we already know it. Once Kierkegaard said, "To be a woman is so strange, so complicated that not one predicate comes near expressing it, and that the multiple predicates that one would like to use are so contradictory that only a woman put up with it." Is it's an old statement, uh, but what we get it from, that this is a sort of conception for women in men's world. It is still difficult for a larger part of the society to conceive women as just as a human being, a normal human being. Nevertheless, we have come a long way since that statement, and it has been harshly criticized by many feminists. So, I shall start with the most apparent. Uh, we all know that not just women, but each one of us are subject to many kinds of control and authority in our lives. These controls can range anywhere between anything, right from political to legal, profession to work related, cultural to social, and ethnic, familial to religious, etc. But in almost all societies, women and girls are also subject to male authority, which is exercised through all of these other forms of authority. The call for empowerment of women and children, who are almost half of the population, of the world's population, has primarily been in response to an rejection of male authority over women. And it has defined primarily as a need of achieving gender equality. The word empowerment indicates towards the lack of power in women. The implication is that woman is a victim or she is a helpless being. But what does women empowerment truly mean? Empowerment is rather a subjective notion. It has no universal definition, with different cultures and societies having their own different definitions for different contexts. So it is rather a complex term to describe. It can start with having right to be fed properly, right to be educated, the permission to drive individually, and it can range up to representing one's own country on the highest level. Independence is one of the central concerns for those advocating women empowerment. The most commonly accepted concept of empowerment being allowing women to have more control over their lives, participation in decision making, freedom to make their own choices, their own schedule, gain some self reliance, etc. So, empowerment of women encompasses a myriad of indicators. A large part of this comes with the financial freedom, as we all know it. So, when one is recognized and utilized within the organization, that is the indicator of empowerment. Whether it's a professional organization like ours or even within the family, gender roles may vary in a family. Who's cooking and who's taking care of the kids, or who is the bread earner. It can also be conventional, uh, like it has been forever. But recognition of labor is significant. Without the recognition of the labor, there is no empowerment. Personal empowerment is the key to the entire empowerment process, and it involves fundamental psychological and social changes. At the personal level, these processes involve developing confidence and abilities while undergoing the effects of internalized oppression. The empowerment process begins by confronting ways in which women internalize their low social status, and by assisting groups and individuals to realize that they have a legitimate part to play in decision affecting their lives and the lives of the others who are dependent upon her. Uh, so with this, I have prepared some data for you. I know this data is pretty much available on Google and everywhere, but it goes on with today's topic. So I'm sharing the screen.
Yes.
Uh, my, is my screen visible now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you so much. So with that, we see that uh, the census actually takes place every 10 years. So we hardly have the exact latest data. But according to the census of 2011, uh, India has reached the population of 1210 million, as against the 301 million in 1951, of which 48.5% were females, the half of the population, as we say. So the population of India counted for 17.5% of the total world population and we still occupy the second place. The sex ratio was 930 in 1971, and it has increased to 940 according to 2011 census. And in the recent times, it has further improved. The female literacy also increased from 18.3% in 1961 to 74% in 2011, and a decrease in male female literacy gap from 26.6% in 1981 to 16.7% in 2011. Now, what we see from this, that women empowerment in India is pretty much uh, dependent on many different variables. It's not just education, or it's not just money. So these variables may include the geography, the geographical locations, rural or urban, uh, educational status, social status, caste and class, and of course age. Uh, it is. It's not that the state is not doing anything. Uh, there are policies that exist for women empowerment at every level, national, state level, panchayat level. everywhere. There are initiatives which have been taken for gender equality. There have been several schemes by government, even at present, that are aiming at women empowerment and gender equality in India. There are schemes like Dhanalakshmi or short stay homes, Swadhar, Ujjwala, scheme for gender budgeting, National Mission for Empowerment of Women, Rashtriya Mahila Kosh, Integrated Child Development Services, Rajiv Gandhi Scheme for Empowerment of Adolescent Girls, the Rajiv Gandhi National Crèche Scheme for Children of Working Mothers, Integrated Child Protection Scheme, and others. Uh, so, what is common here is that education is the single most important factor to ensure gender equality and empowerment. So, the next data would cover up that part of my address. We all know the importance of education in day-to-day lives, not just for women, but for all of us. But enrollment of girls on the primary education level or secondary education level or higher education level has not been same as of the male child. So enrollment of girls in primary education, survival, and the transition to higher levels of education leads to achieving gender parity in education. So here's a chart. Is this chart we see the literacy rate has progressed substantially since the independence, but the women are still far behind men in comparison. From you can pretty much see here that uh, from 1951, 18.3 to 73%, and from 27 and 8% for female, we have come up to 73% up to 2011. In 2020, the situation has further improved, but there is a huge gap between these two data. 80.9% and 64.6%. This is actually an indicator. This gap is actually an indicator of the women not being empowered. This is one of the indicators, not something very vast. Now, during 2010 and 11 to 2014 and 15, according to the NSO data, substantial progress has been achieved towards gender parity in education, as by some of the important indicators. The Gender Parity Index, or GPI, is the ratio of number of female students enrolled at primary, secondary, and higher level educations to the corresponding number of male student of each level. So the GPI, which is based on GER, which is free from the effects of the population structure of the appropriate age group, provides a sort of picture of gender equality in education. So during further, I'll show you a chart. This is for all category of students. So during this uh, 2010 to 2011, and then we come straight to 2014-15, and then further 15 and 16. The substantial progress has been made, achieved towards gender parity in education, as we see in this. So these are the pointers. So it can be noticed that in primary education, the uh, enrollment is favorable to females, as the GPI has crossed the level of 1. In secondary and higher education further, uh, a rapid progress has been observed during the recent past towards gender parity. So we see from this trend that the implementation is a root problem. Not just that, lack of gender sensitization contributes to this. Um, the Global Gender Gap Index of 2016 observed that India is, or the world is simply not doing enough for its women. Um, Further, in the literacy rate in terms of number of girls per 100 boys, as we see in the chart, right from 1951 to 2008, and then from 2008 to 2015 and 16. The literacy rate in terms of girls per 100 boys enrolls, it shows that during study period from 2010 to 11 and 2014-15 further, a remarkable change has been identified at all levels of education. It can be said that perhaps 8 to 10% of growth is recorded in the upper primary, secondary, and then the higher education during the study period. The literacy rate is in terms of number of girls per 100 boys. Um, uh, it has actually improved, and significantly it has improved. So, where are we lacking then? Because we see that when it comes to higher education, there is a sudden drop. This sudden drop can be associated with marriage and then having children. This sudden drop can be associated with lack of having an aim. This sudden drop can be associated with poor health, or whatever you can think of it. Then again, when it comes to the workplace, women's participation in labor force is seen as a signal of declining discrimination and increasing empowerment of women everywhere. It is thought that feminization of the workforce is also a sign of improvement of women's opportunity and the position in society. Share of women in employment measures the degree to which labor markets are open to women in industry and service sectors, which affects not only the equal employment opportunity for women, but also somewhere the economic efficiency through flexibility of the labor market, and reflect economic factors in the social empowerment of women. Here is the parameter related to employment based on employment unemployment survey, and this is the latest data we have of 2015 and 16. So what we see here, that the labor force participation rate of women is low. It's pretty much low, that because men still are the primary bread earner, the primary provider of the family. So the labor force participation rate for women is low, and a sizable gender gap persists everywhere. And now we are talking about this 2020, or this the 31st century. We are not talking about the India right after the independence. Moreover, when women work, they tend to end up in marginal jobs. One of the most intense debates in recent year uh, has centered on the declining labor force participation rate of women in India, which dropped from 42.7% to 31.1% during 2010-11 and 2014-15. Uh, in the share of regular wage and salaried workers, female share is increased from 8.4% to 12.1% during the study period. The NSSO periodic labor force survey report for 2017-18 that was assessed by Business Standards said that the decline in the LFPR for female age group of 15 years and above was between 2011-12 and 17-18. Compared to 2011 and 12, the LFPR for females fell by around 8% points to 23.3% in 2011, 17-18, whereas the LFPR for males dipped by 4 percentage points to 75.8% in 2017-18. The 2017-18 report of the NSSO also said that the fall in the rural areas. Can you see the can you see the
Yes.
data? There is a disruption in the. Yeah, I heard noises. That's why. So the 2017-18 report of the NSO also said that the fall in the LFPR was far more in the rural areas, from 67.7% to 58.7%, than the urban areas, from 49.3% to 47.6%. See, this all is data, but it actually tells you something. The strength of any organization is its people, is a norm of the world of business. When we talk about the corporate sector, for example, the organizations are constantly innovating on not just keeping their employees happy, but also creating a culture for them to thrive. So they constantly revisit their people strategies, analyze what they can do better to be a workplace recognized globally by its people policies. One of the key areas companies across the world are focusing are on gender diversity and equality. And when we talk about equality, we have to keep in mind that equality for women and women is not the same. When a woman works, and I may be talking on a very conventional terms, it there is a whole household behind her, the household and the children. So giving uh, facilities, for example, when we talk about children, women are actually associated with children. I'm not talking about the women who opt not to have, but uh, there are many organizations who are keeping up with the crutches and the daycare facilities for women that actually facilitates women to work peacefully. So this is equity, just equal pay and equal gaze won't work. No doubt, women have made tremendous progress in the corporate world. The simple truth being, female professionals continue to face challenges in making great strides in their organizations, with the plethora of issues still restraining their true potential. Multiple studies have shown a direct correlation between gender diversity and organizational performance, resulting in
Excuse me,
improved.
Nidhi ji.
Yes,
Your
yes.
screen has gone black.
Oh, uh, can
Ha,
you see it
ha, ha,
now?
ha. Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
Oh, yeah. I was coming to the political scenario later on. That's why. Maybe. So, multiple studies have shown, as I was saying earlier, that direct correlation between gender diversity and the organizational performance, resulting in improved team performance, creativity, and productivity and success. Um, so, empowerment somewhere means social power coming a long way to the political power, which leads women to make political claims, resulting in legal and institutional changes. The process of claim making is uh, the process of claim making is strengthened through social networking, which reinforces the process of uh, social, psychological, and political empowerment. Greater participation of women in social and political sphere serve as a tool for empowerment of women, and it contributes to gender sensitive decision making. As far as India's political scenario is concerned, women really have a very poor representation in the uh, India's houses, the upper houses, the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, and also a total of 62 females have been elected in the general election of 2014, constituting only 11.4 share in the Lok Sabha, while in the Rajya Sabha only 11.9 representatives are women at present. I haven't taken the latest data into account yet. On an average, in the states, women share only 8% in the assemblies and only 4% in the state councils as on 1st of August 2014. And representation of women in the PRIs has increased to 46.7% as on 1st March 2013, which is a good indicator. And when it comes to the judiciary, there are only 2 women judges out of 30 judges in the Supreme Court, and only 58 women judges out of 609 judges in different high courts, with maximum 25% of Delhi High Court and no women judge in the 6 courts as on 1st of April 2014. So, uh, what we are seeing here is that access to resources is important for economic freedom of women, as freedom of movement is linked with their economic independence, and it also infuses with power and expense agency somewhere. Um, the National Family Health Survey has identified 5 important variables, namely the knowledge of loan program for women, getting loan, having a bank account, high educational attainment, and working outside as a measure of economic independence. So these are some of the variables which can be indicators of women being empowered. I'm just stop sharing the screen now. I can work without that. So uh, as you all of you have seen that what we see here is an economic aspect of the empowerment. No doubt it is important, and it is not sufficient condition itself. A sense of self confidence, along with the self esteem, also plays an important role in women's potential to mobilize external strengths for bringing about, let's say, fundamental changes. In addition, the uh, internal constraints, such as women's health and education, are critical for meeting the long term goal of emancipation. Furthermore, uh, her concept of empowerment is premised on addressing women's strategic interests, which leads to transforming these structures of subordination at the family or civil society or state or even global levels through collective actions. We all know, and it's a reality, that women are multitaskers. The importance of diversity and gender equality at the workplace has gained prominence in the past few years. Empowerment of women has now truly become a global movement. It is very important to develop, it is a very important development objective under the UN's Sustainable Program goal. Uh, More and more companies, corporates, and organizations have realized and accepted the fact that the empowerment of women has a profound impact on overall business performance as well. So, creating an ecosystem that helps women balance the multiple roles they play in life is essential to the empowerment of women. It is very customary to say that being a housewife or being a homemaker is a matter of choice. Practically, in our country, it is a choice until one attains a government job, and that too under the pressure of the family or the in laws. This is not empowerment. Empowerment has a lot to do with choice. Choice is associated many times with financial hold. And then there is a whole cycle which goes on. Women of almost all classes and all the spheres of life need empowerment. Holding a career is not empowerment. Just holding a career is not empowerment. No matter how much you earn, if you can't spend a penny without uh, your family's consent, it's not empowerment. Uh, this is it is not even empowerment in the at the part of the you know female head of the family who holds the financial decision. It's a sort of a tyranny where there is such a situation, which is more a matter of psychology, the insecurity associated with one's familial, social, and financial status. Maybe knowledge is empowerment, awareness is empowerment, right to choose is empowerment. And this is this has to be associated and taken into consideration at the grassroots level. People sitting in academia like us and discussing its finds makes sense, but it is also required in the lower and lower middle class levels. Um, it's not that on those level gender sensitization programs are not happening, but that not up to the mark. We actually need war scale program for gender sensitization. That is the need of the day, and that will do for it. So that's all by me. Thank you so much for bearing with me and the boring datas. Over to you, Dr. Karmakar. Dr. Karmakar, are you here? Hello, Dr. Karmakar, are you here?
Huh?
Dr. Karmakar,
Your voice is cracking, Nidhi.
can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm done. Yes, so I'm done with my presentations.
Okay, now there are a few questions. So
Yeah, sure. I'm
let
happy
me
to.
ask you those. So there is a question that in the Indian context, does women's economic empowerment increase domestic violence? And if so, then what role can social workers play in addressing the issue?
It's I think it's quite the opposite. Uh, Most of the time, as I have seen, and I have worked with some of the NGOs in the past too, what I have seen that when women do not have the financial freedom, which is associated with the job and other things, she is bound to uh, bear all kinds of torture or domestic violence which is happening on her. And yeah, courage is actually important with that, courage to leave the home and everything, but that actually comes with the financial independence that is necessary. So when I say financial independence, it doesn't necessarily mean um, job. 90% time it does, but there also there should also be the recognition, because the uh, the household work do not have a recognition, mostly the financial recognition. If it has, then perhaps it would and when we are saying about the social workers, as I said in the presentation, gender sensitization programs at the world scale are the need of the hour. and from the very lower level. If I have a 6 years old son, so I would start with that level, teaching him about the consent, teaching him about, because in the class when he goes, I'll just give you a very naive example. Still, the uh, the nursery rhymes of on that level. Papa ka paisa gol gol, mama ki roti gol gol. This is a very regressive mindset still. We see that. So we have to start from there. Then it is useful.
Okay. I'm also telling that if you can stop your cam, then I guess the connectivity can be improved a bit.
Oh, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Is it okay now?
Hmm. Yes. Then there
Yeah,
is another
okay.
question.
Yeah,
Hmm.
sure.
That should we rethink that indicators of women empowerment due to the influence of varied cultural ontologies of women empowerment?
Sorry, can I have the question again? The voice is breaking.
Should we rethink the indicators of women empowerment
Mm-hmm.
is going on because of the influence of various other cultural ontologies?
Why do you think so? If there are no, when you say the culture ontologies, do you also mean to say the Western culture, or just the Indian culture, or the Indian subcontinent as a whole? Then I'll be able to answer the question.
Okay. Then there is another question that
No, I
policies are
haven't
there.
answered. Okay.
Yes. No, that he has just answered. Yeah, he has just asked this question only. That should we rethink the indicators of women empowerment due to the influence of varied cultural ontologies of women empowerment?
See, we
I
live in a
think
global world.
yes,
It's impossible for you to be totally aloof from the impact which is happening here, and the impact is happening for good. Because when we know, as a woman, I know about the type of society the West is having, the open society, the open West society. I also know about some of the regressive societies which are way behind our own country. So we it's difficult to think in in isolated terms. But even if there is no there are no such effects, you sorry, so even if there are no such effects, aren't the condition of women is qualified to be improved on its own merit?
yes, that is there. That is the way we have to think of. Then there is another question that
Mhm.
what do you think? Only financial independence can guarantee empowerment?
No, I didn't say that. And I have said that time again in my presentation. Only financial independence is not guaranteeing that. Because when I say financial independence, there should be an implication of right to choose. But
Yes,
financial independence is one of the main players in the game.
yes. So, mm, isn't the very notion of empowerment but itself patriarchal in nature and something that was powerless has been vested power? So,
These, yeah.
we are the women
See,
actually powerless or we are powerful? What will be your take on it?
this is actually a jumbling and play of the words. I don't think we're here to play with the words. Yes, when in the very beginning of my presentation, I said that when we use the word empowerment, we actually imply the lack of power.
Yes,
women, when we say women needs to be empowered, it means that yes, there are certain areas of life, certain spheres of life where women are still not able to be in control of their own life, let alone others, or let alone of her children or anyone else.
Yes. There is another question that why should the West to be taken as the model of progress unless we are looking at only material empowerment?
What other, uh, sorry, is,
Why should the West be taken as the model of progress?
do you have a better model of progress for other than West? And yes, see, I have heard this question time and again, and uh, it is one of the main concerns of Indian feminism also, that West should not be the model of. And yeah, of course, see, when I like to take this opportunity to say this. See, labor division is not a bad thing, it's a very good thing. It's that one person is a breadwinner and other person is taking care of the home. It's very good until that. And in Indian society, in the ancient Indian society, there were no housewives. There were, we used to call them grihini. She is a sort of head of the house, and house is around her. But the main problem comes along with development, the materialistic development, no doubt about that. The main problem comes when the responsibilities or the labor division is associated with your identity and with the financial independence. If a woman, even if a homemaker has her own sustainability in terms of finance, then I don't think West has any game to play here. But that doesn't happen in real life.
Okay. It is often said that private sector's leaders have a key role to play in addressing the issues and ensuring that their workplaces offer equal opportunities and fair treatment to both women and men. And one crucial aspect of this is zero tolerance for abuse and harassment. So, don't you think that more Me Too movement uh, should be there to recognize the scale of sexual harassment and other forms of violence in home
uh,
in and in other areas also?
See, your question is covering a large number of a large amount of sphere. I'll try to answer that. See, Me Too movement is just the tip of the iceberg. It has just
Yes.
started. If you ask any woman, I just look around you and ask if any woman if she has been harassed, touched, or even raped in her entire life, the answer would be yes. Something or the other has actually happened. If a woman is asking the question, then also, uh, see, the thing is that such movements are in India and in the world are illicit, are movements of the elites. It has nothing to do with a labor class. It has nothing to do with a woman working in the office as a clerk. On the elite level, we have seen it. And the movement happens mostly on the social media, naming people, and then happens nothing. And that's why I said earlier, this is not a law and order problem. This is a socio-cultural problem. We need gender sensitization from the very grassroots level. No amount of Me Too movements or no amount of the punishment, no amount of punishment or law and order can solve this.
Okay. But you know that unfortunately, in spite
Mhm.
of education and in spite of being uh, employed in private and government sector, women undergo a lot of domestic violence. What is your take on it? When we are talking about that employment and at the same time education can help women to get empowered, but in actual Indian scenario, uh, this is not at all true, because domestic violence is still there, and in this COVID scenario, we are witness to different kinds of domestic violence. So why employment and why education fail to give women that kind of shelter?
That's a very interesting question, and I may give some politically incorrect and unpopular answer to that.
Yes, yes, please
Firstly,
do.
we have no data when there was no employment for women and no education for women. What was the condition of domestic violence then? Secondly, it's not that domestic violence happens only on one level. We have no idea about the domestic violence being held on men.
Yes,
Thirdly, uh, yes, in spite of being educated, in spite of being employed, women do suffer the domestic violence. Men or the in-laws or whoever is the partner is uh, uh, putting the women in such condition is responsible, but women for a larger part are really responsible for it. So, as I said in my presentation, merely employment, merely holding a financial role will not uh, is not sufficient in this case, unless and until you have the guts to uh, retaliate towards the situation. And uh, all the problem is, and I'm saying, I think for the third or the fourth time, uh, all this is leveled around there on the grassroots level. If
yes,
you are teaching your toddler son or girl not to harass somebody, about the consent, about the domestic violence, or he or she is actually watching you tolerating the domestic violence, you can very pretty much think about the situation when he or she grows into a full woman and man. We are responsible for it. And for that, we need an entire, what I would say, in the entire kind of transformation in the school courses, in the family business, everything.
okay. You just tell
I
me that
must
how NGO is affecting women's lives, the role of NGO in this context.
see. I have, as a student, I have worked for several NGOs, and my mother has been working in the NGOs for quite a number of time. And I'll give you some examples. Maybe that would help. Um, so we were living in this really poor area of a town, and there were many women were subjected to regular domestic violence and every kind of thing. So uh, my with the help of her larger NGO, my mother started other NGO, one small NGO, which were teaching women to, or not teaching exactly, training women for different vocational courses. That helped a lot because for the larger part of time, the women were uh, gaining the training, they were working, they were earning money. That actually instills a lot of confidence in them. It's not that domestic violence was eradicated all of a sudden, but yet it was lessened. And yeah, financial independence for women was also pretty much beneficial for their kids.
At the same time, no, this is the last question I am taking. This is
Yeah,
not the question. Actually, it's my observation
yeah,
that
sure, I'll happy to.
while we are talking about women and empowerment and their the kind of domestic violence, at the same time, you have also mentioned that there are a lot of male and transgender who are also being who are also come across this kind of domestic violence, they are also
Yes, right.
exploited, and often they have been exploited by upper class women or empowered women. So don't we
Hmm.
think that yes, we all have to sensitize our mind?
Exactly. This is what I said, the gender sensitization. And it is not women sensitization, it is gender sensitization.
Yes,
It's for every gender. And gender in today's terms is very fluid.
yes. Okay, so um, I would just like to propose a hearty vote of thanks to you for gracing today's evening in this illustrious way and delivering
I
today's
just hope
inaugural
I was
address.
useful.
Yes, yes. Mm, your talk certainly provided us with welcome updates in this genre,
Can I make
particularly.
a small comment if I am not taking, uh, you know, can I just
Yes,
make a
yes, yes,
small comment? You're not taking your
yes.
time extra. Just in a
No, no,
comment,
no, no, no.
I
Please
am
go
reading
ahead.
by one of your participants that especially women exploit women. This is something I hear so much.
Yes,
I just and particularly in terms of mother-in-law, it happens. I ask, when the woman is exploiting woman, what is the male partner of yours doing at that time? Why he
yes,
doesn't interfere and try to make a balance or a bridge between the two? It's really difficult for anyone to expect an elderly woman, or I'm not taking sides, but it's easier to make something understand to your life partner other than the older generation. So at least you can start doing it right now, that you do. At least if you are supposed to be a mother-in-law in future, you do not do the same thing with the daughter-in-law, then the cycle will stop there, like the COVID cycle.
yes, that is there. And at the same time, we all must have to admit the fact that while women are being subjugated, domesticated, treated inhumanly, but at the same time, they do love their partners a lot, and that's why hats up to them, hats up to their sacrifice and everything they are doing for those men also who are not so eligible enough for them. At the same time, it is also worth mentioning in this context.
Yes, yes, right.
So uh, but and at the same time, regarding your talk will provide much needed help to them uh, who want to do further research on these areas. And thanks again for giving a tremendous momentum to a truly memorable evening. Your
Thank you
talk will
so
urge,
much.
and your talk will urge others also to join in and take concrete actions to ensure women's economic empowerment and a moral equal workplace for all employees and staff. And on a
That's
personal note, I hope that you will join us again someday, somewhere, to address burning issues like this. But till then, stay safe, healthy, and take care. And yes, I'm happy
thank you
to
so
have you
much.
there.
I am honored, and thank you so much again. The pleasure was all mine, completely. So, shall I just leave the counter now?
Yes, yes, yes. Please,
Okay.
please.
Thank you
And
so
thanks
much.
for
Over to you.
being there.
Anytime.
So now we are moving towards the second session of this last day faculty development program on gender sensitization. And yes, we still have two more talks to sensitize our mind, to sensitize our thoughts, to sensitize our actions, initiatives, and or observations. Yes, I'm reading all the comments also. Schools and colleges are the grounds for this kind of sexist activities. To some extent, I also do agree to the fact. So now we have with Dr. Swati Krishna is and she is an assistant professor in English in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Ropar, India. Dr. Krishna, yes, you can turn.
Hello.
Yes, yes. Let me just
Yeah.
let me
Doctor.
just introduce
Yeah.
you. So, Dr.
Yeah. Sure.
Krishna's research interests include contemporary American literature, women's literature, road narratives, feminist theory, and gender studies. And she has a PhD in English from the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. And her doctoral project focuses on literary narratives on travel written by contemporary American women writers. Dr. Krishna has published papers in national and international journals and encyclopedias. And today she will talk on women on the road, literary representations, possibilities, and dangers. Now the stage is for you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamakar. I hope I'm audible. There are no disturbances.
No, you are perfectly audible.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you and the organizing team for hosting this FTP on such a pertinent issue or of India as well as the world. And we need more conversations, more dialogues on this. And I hope the listeners, all of you, are safe and fine at home. Today, I'm introducing, which is my research area as well. I'm trying to expand it, and the title of my talk is "Women on the Road: Literary Representation, Possibilities, and Dangers." When I talk about travel, what comes to your mind would be travel logs, as in tracks, travel logs written by writers who have undertaken real actual travel, right? But in my seminar or in my area of research, I would include the fictional characters who have undertaken journeys in works of novels, in drama, in fiction. So these fictional characters' journeys are also included under travel narrative. And I will start with the historical analysis and move to the representation of women on the road and later to the dangers of the road for the female character. So I would also like to introduce this area of travel literature for the scholars who are interested to work in this genre. Also, I will stop my camera now to ensure better connectivity, and I will share my slides with you. And if there is any disturbances or something, you can let me know. Is it visible, Dr. Kamakar?
Yes, yes, it is.
Yes. Okay, I hope my camera is off and you can hear me.
Yes, yes, perfectly.
Yes. Okay, so my title, as I've told you, is Women on the Road: Literary Representation, Possibilities, and Dangers. And I would like to start with a very pertinent quote, which is by Linda McDowell. She has written a seminal text, Gender, Identity, and Place, Understanding Feminist Geographies, and she examines how gender is linked to geography. Do men and women live different lives in different parts of the world? So I'll just read out this quote. Travel, even the idea of traveling, challenges the spatial association between home and women that has been so important in structuring social construction of femininity in the West. In Western social theories and institutional practices, because it has been taken for granted for so long that a woman's place was in the home, the history of her movement was ignored. So I guess this is a continuation, a happy extension to the talk or the seminar that you had before. So she talks about the Western context where the women's sphere of importance is confined to the home. So we know, which is very pertinent in the Indian context as well. So I'll talk a bit about the genre of road narratives. Mm, in the historical as well as in fictional accounts, road has largely been a masculine domain. So women have traditionally been associated with stasis. Stasis means inertia, rootedness, and um, home, propriety, with a convention, etc. And the sphere of travel and adventure has always been for the male. So, a significant change happens with the latter half of the 20th century following the gender and cultural movements. Significantly, I'm talking about the second wave feminist movement, which in many ways contributed to the presence of women on road in fiction as well as in reality. So, a significant road critic, Ronald Primiu, he has stated that the road um, for the traveler offers escape and adventure with its carnivalesque disruption of the ordinary. So, what does this mean? So, when you are on the road, you are free from schedules, we are free from commitments, you suspend for a time your identity, your origins, your geography, your profession, etc. So in this road, you reconstruct your identity. You are away from your commitments for a moment of time, and this would give you time for introspection and self reflexivity. And for a woman's journey, significantly since the area of journey, she is confined within patriarchal domesticity, the road offers a site of individuation, of selfhood, and also a site of escape as well as protest. So now I will put to examine some absences of female characters in Anglo-American travel narratives. You would know that classical quest is male-centric. Let it be the Odyssey, epic poems, Iliad, Aeneas. So the exploits of they celebrate the exploits of heroes such as the Odysseus, Achilles, Aeneas, respectively. And travel and adventure has largely been dedicated to the male hero. Okay, so in the English literature, which came after the Middle Ages, for instance, in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, a group of pilgrims travel from London to Canterbury, and among these 30 pilgrims, only 3 were women. Okay, so unlike there are these the prioress, the second nun, and the wife of Bath. So among these three characters, only wife of Bath, who is a much traveled, much sexualized character, who can be called a prototype of modern female traveling character. The rest two, they travel to perform their Christian duties. So later tales, after the Middle Ages, Shakespeare's heroes mostly are men. Adventure seekers are mostly men. Also, for instance, think of As You Like It or the female characters traveling in Shakespeare's plays. The female character, like Rosalind, when she has to travel, she disguises as a man to prevent or to protect herself from the dangers of the road for a woman traveling alone. Okay, now we'll talk about um, the exploratory tales. The tradition of travel within the European world can be traced back to Renaissance, and there are these traveling exploratory figures such as Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus, Captain Cook, etc. And these colonial journeys, they traveled for much mercantile purposes, and this was the start of European imperialism, right? And the exploratory tales produced during the European colonization, which include Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Swift's Gulliver's Travels, also, as you know, portray male characters, male protagonists. Um, so Eric J. Lead, a critic, have in his work from sorry in these exploratory tales we have talked about, and the canonized travel literature has traditionally ignored women's journeys. Okay, so Eric J. Lead in his work in the mind of traveler from Gilgamesh to global tourism. Um, Gilgamesh is it is a Mesopotamian epic. It is one of the earliest surviving works of literature, and it is about a king, Gilgamesh, okay, from 2100 BC. So he says that from the time of Gilgamesh to modern tourism, travel has always been spermatic, and the dynamism of masculine movement is occasioned by the sessility of women. Sessility is not a proper word. Sessility would mean rootedness, like plants. Women are rooted, and their rootedness, their status would enable the masculine movement. Okay. When we come to more recent, American classics, now we have talked about the British classics. Now coming to American quest classics, the heroic explorer is always a white man. Think about Natty Bumppo in Leatherstocking's Tales, the manic quester Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, or Huck Finn, the wandering vagabond, Huck Finn in Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So all these characters celebrate hegemonic masculinity, the white masculinity, right? Mm, and the even in this traditional, we have seen masculine tradition of American quest narratives. The 20th century, coming to the 20th century, which witnessed many technological and scientific advancements, and the travel sector was changed by the arrival of Model T, which is a very inexpensive car which was brought out by Ford in 1908. So with the arrival of Model T, the genre, the impact of travel changed altogether. And with this, cross country trips, cross state trips becomes common in the United States. And the works which came out were John Steinbeck's The Wayward Bus, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, Clancy Seagal's Going Away. So before venturing into anything else, I should talk about Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which is one of the prototypical road narrative, which laid the genre conventions of road narratives. So, which came out in the 60s. It is an autobiographical in nature, in content. The characters, Sal and Dean, two picaresque characters, or buddy, it belongs to the buddy road genre. Okay, Sal and Dean, which is derived from Kerouac's own life, and Sal and Dean travel um, across the length and breadth of America without any reason, without any aim. So they find acceleration in pure adventure and the continuous motion through the road. So, which this quest narrative, they resist domesticity, they resist convention, and they find meaning in the motion itself, the speed of the car, in the continuous motion of the road. This quest narrative, or the road narrative, which was marked by the absence of female characters. Female characters may appear as sexual objects in these. They were objects of sexual desire, who are left behind. These women characters has to be left behind so that the male heroes could continue on their journey. So many critics have argued that the road heroes, the mobility is occasioned by the sessility or rootedness of women. In many post-war American writers, including Norman Mailer, Saul Bellow, John Updike, many of them have captured the restless spirit and the wanderlust of the road heroes, but they also focus mainly on the male experience. So when does the changes come about? When does women started appearing in the road, on the road, or appearing in the road genre, which happens as you have maybe had several discussions on the second wave feminist movement. So the second wave feminist demanded So it doesn't mean I'm saying that there were no travel narratives written by women in the previous years. There were some marginal works written by female travelers, as well as fiction which portray female characters. So but it becomes so common, and there was an outpouring of literature by female writers post second wave feminist movement. So second wave feminists demanded both the professional as well as the personal rights for women. They campaigned to reclaim the public space for women. So they questioned the patriarchal structure of the nuclear family. So they claimed that the patriarchal nuclear family structure has to be changed, has to be shuffled, and the women should come out of these confines of domesticity to engage in intellectual endeavor, to engage in the public sphere. Some important texts include Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Beauvoir claimed that traditional marriage would confine women to immanence, while the male for traditional marriage doesn't confine men. Men's vocation is action, adventure. They have to fight, produce, create. Likewise, Betty Friedan, she examined the dissatisfaction and discontent of American housewife in domestic chores, in housekeeping, in mind-numbing domestic chores, and argued for their social and intellectual agencies. So the second wave feminist they or conveyed this radical belief that women's emancipation could be achieved by transcending the domestic sphere, and which could be affected by refashioning the structure of the nuclear family. So, in response to the powerful radical claims made by these second wave feminists, women's fiction, which were produced later, portrayed radical female characters. So some include these names: John Didion, Erica Jong, Anne Tyler, Doris Betts, etc. One marked difference that the critics find in female road narratives as opposed to male road narratives is that they travel. There is a ubiquitous presence of children, especially daughters, in these women's texts. They are not detached endeavors of bravado, of aggressiveness, but they travel with their children, or they create their home wherever they travel. So there's a presence of children, daughters, there is bonding, sisterhood, mother-daughter bond in these some of the travel narratives produced by women in the 1980s. Some examples are Simpsons Anywhere But Here, Barbara Kingsolver's The Bean Trees, and its sequel, The Pigs in Heaven. If you're interested, you could go and read these books, which are very significant, pertinent tales of women's journeys. Moving on, this change was reflected in the popular culture of the time as well. This significant movie, which came out in the 1990s, Thelma and Louise, portray these two radical female characters, outlaws traveling through America. So it doesn't mean that these women do not face any problems on the road. They face abandonment, sexual vulnerability, destitution, but facing these problems, these issues, they also emerge resilient and empowered by their experiences. So female quest narratives, and I would give you two recent Tracks is written way back, but it has been made into a movie recently, and Wild by Cheryl Strayed, which was also which was written in 2012, a contemporary women's road narrative. It portrays Straight's experience of hiking more than 1,000 miles from California to Mojaveras Desert, and she carries this immense backpack and travels by her own with the grief of her mother's death. And during this journey, she experiences physical challenges, emotional challenges, and also have several spiritual realizations in the journey. Likewise, Robin Davidson's Tracks, it's a trek through Australian deserts over 9 months by the writer. and most of the time her journey is solo, and during this journey she finds clarity and a self awakening through this through through these treks. So these are some, if you're interested you could read. So, women's journeys are powerful artifacts in challenging patriarchal authority as well as female subjugation or subordination, because it has been across cultures, women have been traditionally confined to domesticity, and the act of crossing this threshold to engage in the quest is itself an act of tremendous transgression. So now we'll move to the Indian scenario. My area of research is not Indian literature, but I would like to give you a certain points about the Indian travel narrative and the um, genre of Indian travel fiction. Several in the coming to the Indian scenario, the historical developments in the East, including the resistance for liberation, which is the freedom struggle, mass migration, decolonization, globalization, all these factors had immense impact on the travel writing of times. Um, when we talk about Indian travel writers, we cannot ignore the British authors who have come to India and who have written about India, including Rudyard Kipling, E.M. Forster, Eric Newby. Pico Iyer is an Indian he's an Indian writer. He's an Indian by origin. His parents has traveled to Britain because his father worked there. Then they moved to America, where they lived for some time, and he married a Japanese woman. So his identity, he says in all his works, is extremely conflicted and complicated. So moving to then B.S. Naipaul and William Dalrymple. So this movement of Indian travel narrative is from colonial identity to more of a humanistic perspective, which is of E.M. Forster. He rises above imperialistic conflicts to bring about a humanistic perspective to a more post-colonial. When we talk about travel literature in the Indian scenario, diasporic fiction comes into picture. Women's accounts of travel largely is found in largely in diasporic literature. For some names include Bharati Mukherjee, Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, Meena Alexander, Jumba Lahiri. So the women diasporic writers have created unique space for themselves in the world of literature. Um, and they are first generation in the sense that some writers may have left India to live in other countries out of their own choice to work or study there, or their family moved had to leave India because of economical constraints or political or social reasons. So in their works, they nostalgically recall their motherland, its customs, culture, language, and people. Um, so, in most of their works, we could find issues of the themes recurring, the issues of assimilation, of racial oppression, identity politics, alienation, forced relocation, diasporic tensions, etc. Coming to the voices in India in travel narrative, which would include Janvi Acker, Karabi Deka Hazarika, Rosie Thomas. Janvi has written travel fiction, which is Wanderers All. In the story, she talks about this character, Murlidhar, who had to migrate from a conquered area to Bombay, and how he has to survive with the new culture and the new system. And while she contrasts his figure with the real life travel, sorry, the life story of his granddaughter, the travelogue of his granddaughter, who sets out on a solo trip across the Goan coastline. So the male travel as well as the female travel is compared and contrasted in this work. Um, Rosie Thomas Hazarega is an Assamese writer, and Rosie Thomas has written Malayalam works on her journeys in America, and I'm sure you can find many new voices, and these are less explored and in research. You could work on these new authors who are in the writing in the travel genre. So, no analysis of women's travel is complete without talking about women's physical vulnerability in the gendered public sphere. Here, I would start with a quote by Susan L. Robertson. She's very clearly states that in addition to the other risks and dangers of the road, when women are subject to sexual risk, to themselves being the territory that is explored and conquered by others. So there's immense sexual vulnerability that women face when they are in the gendered public space. Um, Keeping in mind the fact that despite women's emancipation and the success of women's movement, there is always a largely regressive approach to women's bodies in the public spaces. The reason for it is that um, the streets, the public spaces belong to men. Women are not supposed to circulate freely in these domains, especially after dark. Because if they do so, if they happen to violate, if something is to happen to the women uh, who come to these male domains, and if something happens to them, they are immediately said to have asked for it. The women have asked for the violence committed upon them since they were in the places after dark, in these male spheres which were forbidden for them in at night, maybe after dark. Um, so in so women coming out of this domestic confines to engage with the public sphere, they're often put into place through this act of rape. So male dominated society, in a male dominated society, the rape myths assume that women ask to be raped for by dressing in a certain manner or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It supports male violence if a woman is perceived to be out of line, um, and the victim is blamed for the violence that or the crime that is committed upon her. So it altogether it would mean that if a woman act as if they are free as men, they act as if they are free as men. They are punished with assault, battery, murder, etc. So this fear of rape keeps women at home at night, out of streets at night, keeps them passive and modest for the fear of being provocative. So the second wave feminism have challenged patriarchy and for imposing these spatial limitations on women and curtailing their freedom with the threat of rape. In this context, I'm sure that many of you are reminded of the Nirbhaya case in New Delhi, which happened in 2012, the heinous gang rape of a 23-year-old woman. When asked in some interview, when the rapist lawyer argued or said that an unmarried woman should not have been out at night, out in the streets at night. So this is rape culture. Rape culture is one that supports the policing of women's behavior if they are perceived to be out of line, which means out at night. Justifies male violence, um, and it serves a reminder for women to be in their proper place. Demonstrate that if they fail to do so, they will be threatened with rape, battery, or murder. So, universally, rape culture justifies male violence and uses fear to curtail female freedom and mobility. So, I'm coming to the conclusion of my talk. So, it is essential that there are governmental policies to eradicate the prevalence of this rape myths. You know, it is in place even now in contemporary societies. I remember when my relatives get to know about this Nirbhaya case, they said the same opinions that a woman of her age shouldn't have been out at night. So this issue is rampant. Rape myths exist in our society, especially in our society. Some issues are doesn't even come out if they are happening in the rural areas, right? So we need governmental policies to eradicate the prevalence of these rape myths, stigma associated with the sexual offenses. Also, when a sexual harassment or violence case is reported, the media's immediate reaction is to demarcate these places as dangerous or delimit women's access to these places. So rather than restricting women's mobility, what I would say is that we need overarching policies to monitor the public spaces and make it more inclusive and less hostile for women. So, hence, it is increasingly necessary for us to engage with this issue, to create a call for social awareness so that women's experience on the public space is not marred or curtailed by the fear of assault or violence. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this wonderful presentation. And at the same time, you were so energetic during the talk.
Oh, is
Thanks a
it?
lot. Yes, 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 absolutely. Now let me take a few questions.
Yeah,
So many
okay.
questions are there, but I won't be able to see that in the started with
Okay.
questions, the chat box and my WhatsApp also. So, um, how male travel writers have portrayed women in their writing?
Uh-huh.
What will be your
In the
take?
case of On the Road, which has I have discussed in detail, women were just accessories that enable the heroes or the traveling male characters' quest. So they were sexual objects they meet on the way, and when they want to continue their journeys, they leave these women behind and continue their journey. That was the aspect in male travel narratives like the one I said. But there were certain travel narratives, especially in by lost generation writers, including Hemingway. They portrayed certain female characters in very positive light, and they portray individualistic female characters undertaking journeys. So I wouldn't say that all of them were portrayed as limited accessories. Some works are there which portray male writers portraying radical female characters undertaking journeys. Sister Carrie is one work that comes to my mind.
Okay. And if I tell you to refer a few Bollywood movies, then what will be according to your choice? Pink or anything like that? Queen or anything?
In the popular culture, which is
Yes, in
very
the popular
common, is
culture.
the one that nowadays there are more movies coming out on female traveling. The thing that comes to my mind, which everybody can relate to, is Highway and
I yes.
Queen, right? And which could show how selfhood is attained towards the end, how the characters changes, attitudes towards life changes through the journey. So this is the avenue that the journey provides for the female character to grow and mature through the journey. So these are the my things that comes, these are popular
Okay.
culture, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in this context, can we take Jab We Meet also and the character of Karina?
Of,
It's
I guess,
thoroughly
of course, I think, yes. But it is more, I think, more serious discussion happened in Highway and Queen, which were more feministic films. I don't know more about Jab We Met, I'm sorry. If you can provide more information, that would be great. I think I don't have seen that film. I'm sorry, Karmakar.
yes, yes, yes. And then
Can you provide details about the movie? Is it can be called it as a travel narrative?
to some extent, Jab We Meet.
Okay.
So
Okay, doctor. Uh-huh.
then there is another question. Hmm,
Mm-hmm.
is that is there any specific feminist theory we can apply to such travel writings where women are neglected?
I guess all of them, as particularly mentioned Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan, many have critiqued the limitations on women's mobility. Even earlier feminists, including the yellow wallpaper was written by sorry, I'm forgetting the name, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was a first wave feminist, if we can include her in that uh, time. So many have if you read their works, they've talked about women's mobility from the first wave feminist movement. So many female feminists have extensively talked about women's mobility, and you can even the most popular names. Okay, so and about rape and sexual violence, Susan Brown Miller has a very extensive work, Men, Women, and Rape, and which changed the definition of rape as an impulsive act, one act committed out of lust, to more ideological perspective. So these would be some suggestions. And especially on travel, I guess there are several texts which were studies of literature which specifically talks about female journeys. um, yeah.
Yes. Okay. Um, Patriarchy gender space, does feminist geography not run the risk of reconsolidation of gendering of space?
Reconstitution of gendering of space, it would mean that we break these shackles and make the public sphere more female friendly, or by gender I would mean all, queer, lesbian, because trans women, there was a journey narrative by a trans woman I wanted to talk about, but I thought it would like lengthen the presentation, so I ignored it. So it should be a space where all genders can feel at home and feel safe, and there should be a breaking down of these barriers, limitations, that limitations, and a free mingling, where all people can feel the space as theirs, not just a gendered space.
In Austen's novels, for example, Pride and Prejudice, women characters often undertake frequent trips.
Yeah.
What will the speaker say about it? What will be your
Yeah,
take on it?
I am reminded of Jane Eyre. The female characters I'm talking about, thinking about Jane Eyre, she is confined within strict moral codes of her time. She is not a licentiate woman, and she is governed by their Christian values, right? There are certain moral and religious perceptions that she is confined with. So I cannot say that she is a radical female traveler as it was in the 70s, post 70s that we see. So her travels are for a larger purpose. So her society confined her in certain barriers, and she works within these barriers. She cannot be called an individualistic quester. For in that case, we could talk about Maud Flanders as well. Maud Flanders in Defoe's Picara, still she's a female Picara, but she is tagged as a licentious woman. Her she is portrayed as a licentious woman whenever in these times when women travelers are portrayed or showcased in fiction. uh, on one side they might be pious, governed by values, Christian moral values. On the other side they may be licentious, they are bad women. So this is what I have to talk about that.
Okay. While Wild and other books beautifully portrays the lived experience of the women, how do you think that topophilia is playing a central role in it? And do you think women who were undertaking the long trekking journey depicts the semiotics of questioning patriarchy?
Of course they do. If the whole slide I have talked about the absences in literature, where women doesn't appear as travelers. There's a whole history of that. So when female travelers undertake these journeys, they're in itself transgressive. Doesn't mean that so they don't portray men in their journeys. That is there, but you have to understand this history or tradition of literature where women have never given a space, or they were, for instance, think of Huckleberry Finn. The women were portrayed as symbols of civilization, of culture. They prevent Huck from undertaking the journey. Think about Moby Dick. These Ahab's mother and the wife had marginal presences. So there is a tradition of long absence,
Then
and with this,
I'm just forgive me for the interruption. Then
Mhm.
how will you take Hardy Stace or Jude? Can we take this kind of works also?
Sorry.
Can we take Hardy Stace or Jude the Obscure? Can we take this kind of works also? in this context? Hardy stays.
I don't understand what you're saying. Hardy? Thomas Hardy is
Ah,
what you're.
yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, yes. Thomas Hardy. Thomas
Yeah.
Hardy, Trace of
Uh-huh.
the D. Arborville's or Jude the
Yes.
Obscure. Can we take also this kind of
Yes,
text
yes,
also?
of course, of course. Tess is another character who can be said as a traveler or an individualistic woman, but she pays inordinately for her transgressions. She's a tragic character. She pays punishment for her transgressive behavior, right?
Yes. Okay. Then, uh, what do you take regarding female Bildungsroman novels?
Sorry,
What will be your take regarding female
Bildungsroman.
Bildungsroman? Yes, Bildungsroman
Yeah,
novel.
like Jane Eyre you're talking about. That's what already told you about that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are symbolic, we can consider them a symbolic journey from birth to death. The whole story is, we can be considered metaphoric symbolic journey in that sense, in buildings Roman
Okay.
novels.
Okay.
Mm.
Then we have come across the fact that in the majority of travel narratives of women in Indian English fiction, we often come across the protagonists who belong to urban and educated upper class or middle class. Do you
Mhm.
think that there
Yes,
is a need to write more about the less privileged women in the travel narratives?
of course, of course. This Indian travel genre is very limited, and I sincerely hope that we see this what I've told you about these women who travel to countries, about first world countries, and then write novels about their travel and experiences. But there are very limited literature on those less privileged women, Dalit women. So I need there should be more works produced. Maybe in Indian context, the problem is that they may be produced in the regional language, but there won't be an English translation. And I hope there is more English translation and there are more works in this field of travel so that more researchers can come up and study those, which would be beneficial for these women's upliftment as well.
Hmm.
So there is a question that is telling that can Don Quixote be mentioned as a critic of travel writing penned by male writers?
Mhm.
It is, of course, yes. Don Quixote.
Yes.
That is, Don Quixote is
Don
the
Quixote,
Spanish
yes.
title, yes.
Yes,
He's a
yes,
Picaro's hero, yes. Of
yes.
course, it can be.
Okay. Isn't there also an economic angle to it? Men can travel at much cheaper cost compared to women, given the safety from sexual and physical assault.
Hmm.
Yes, yes. A
Well,
monetary aspect is there. But nowadays, we see an increasing tendency of women backpackers. There are these blogs which are dedicated to women travelers who travel alone. Even in Delhi now, there are hotels where these people can stay safely. So in these travelers, they don't require large. They travel frugally in the sense that they don't spend much money. They stay. There are certain hostels that they give. Even in I have traveled to McLeodganj recently, and then I have seen their hotels for backpackers at very low rates. Maybe these are just bunk beds, but there are certain now this thing of blog with COVID-19, everything is dismantled. I know that the thing of traveling to another foreign country shouldn't be thought at this moment. But I feel that with the time, this monetary aspect is affecting lesser and lesser on women, and there are certain that they can travel with a lesser cost. Yes, men's monetary condition or situation is what then enable them to undertake travel more often, and that is why we need a comprehensive analysis where women has to engage in the public sphere. They have to work and they have to save for themselves. When more and more women do that, when then there will be more and more women in on the road itself. Yes.
okay. And is there any scope to work uh, on this genre by taking regional novels, those which needs to be translated or those uh, which haven't been translated till now. So if we need to choose some kind of regional text, then what will be your opinion?
Yes, of course, I would support that, encourage that. You need to work, but the problem comes with quoting these texts in your thesis if you're an English literate scholar. So you need to translate it for yourself, maybe for your supervisor, and then you have to include those in your thesis. So there is this problem of translation, and also the problem of translation is discussed. You will lose certain regional authenticity when you translate certain texts. That is there as well. But if you are to do a research, you might have to translate it for yourself as well as your supervisor. So yeah, of course there should be works on it. There should be more literature and more translations, so that the map of Indian literature should be out there, and there should be a significant place for India in the genre of travel narratives. Yes.
Mm, we can also come across the fact that male writers have written a few travelogues, and there are so many female characters are there. We have come across the fact that also they are also moving across the cities and towns, one region to other region. For example, let me take Daniel Defoe's Small Flanders. Even his work Broxton also, and his works not only show the movement but also the violence of the road to car movement. So, how do we look at it in the context of female travelogue? This kind of works like Moll Flanders or Roxana?
I would say, as I've told you, as I've responded before, there were certain female characters which were portrayed in a radical manner by male characters, especially by lost generation writers. But in the case of Maud Flanders, I have said, this woman is not seen as an individualistic, strong woman. She is portrayed as a licentious, considering her social situation, she is considered as a licentious bad woman, right? So she cannot become a precursor or a prototype of the modern female traveler.
Okay, okay. Here, in the context of for the Bengali participants, we can also take
Also,
Nobonita
like
Debsen's
to
travelogue in regional language as a fitting instance for Bengal. Yes, please tell.
No, I'm just reminded of certain works which were published pre 1970s. For instance, the Yellow Wallpaper, or the works which for instance, several works which were produced before 1970s, they showcase very strong female characters. But what happens is that towards the end, they become mad or they are killed off. So they pay for their transgressions. Okay, so that is what a trend that I found in literature written by both men and women.
Yes. So your talk is that if I go to analyze it, your concept of gender space or your concept of regarding this speciality, rather transgression and this kind of broad narratives, it appears to that um, male writers and women writers of various ethnic and social backgrounds, they have tried to remap the condition of Diden society in their cultural geography. And I think their works also cross some kind of disciplinary boundaries and argue that for female literary protagonist also. So this kind of, so your talk creates a kind of open road. So road can be taken as a symbolism here, and also to some extent, uh, let me tell you that all the readers can be taken this kind of examples as where women's physical and emotional well-being is also some kind of perilous stake also, and at the same time they are also a bit adventurous. So thanks a lot for um, taking this kind of issue and for your highly interesting and thought-provoking address. And I'm pretty sure that all the participants have taken note of your suggestions, observations, and ideas. And I'm sure that they will, they will be discussing this with their guides, with their fellow scholars, and with other academicians. And they will certainly take this kind of approach, and they will do certain kind of research, and some kind of research can be initiated on my part also. So thanks for being there, and thanks for
Thank you. Thank
addressing
you.
all the questions, and thanks for the mm, making us strive to see the society, the condition of women in all the travelogues, and thanks for opening the door to a new kind of scholarly understanding. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Thank
being
you,
there.
Doc.
And
Thank you for
okay,
conducting this FDP in such a significant issue.
thanks a lot. Till then, stay safe, and I
Yeah,
hope.
stay safe, all of you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, okay.
Shall I leave the? Yeah.
Yes, yes. Now we are going to the last session, and mm, it's a great honor to have among us Professor Gita Patel and this faculty development program on gender sensitization can be summed up only with a speaker of this stature. Gita Patel is a professor at the University of Virginia with 3 degrees in science and a doctorate from Columbia University, New York, in interdisciplinary South Asian studies in Sanskrit and Urdu. She has published widely in both academic and popular venues and translated lyric and prose from Sanskrit, Urdu, Hindi, Braj, and edited special issues of several journals. Her first monograph, Lyrical Movements, Historical Hauntings on Gender, Colonialism, and Desire in Miraji's Urdu poetry, writes the history of Indian literary modernism through its Arvind Miraji. Dr. Patel's second book, Risky Bodies and Techno Intimacy, Reflection on Sexuality, Media Science, Finance, uses techno intimacy as the locus for interrogating capital, science, media, and desire. Dr. Patel is completing several other projects, a manuscript on the Muslim women writer Ismat Chugtai, a manuscript on fantasies embedded in advertising called Billboard Fantasies, a series of small books on the poetics of historical pensions, insurance, credit, and debt. Her current research is on the ways in which the history of bacteriology and our relationship to our own bacterial life gives rise to our everyday violence. Dr. Patel and Meghan Hartman are also compiling a monograph of their new translation of Miraji's poetry. And she has recently started composing her own lyric under the lockdown in India. And today she will be going to discuss the topic, the much awaited talk of this whole faculty development program. It's about messing around with gender. A very good morning to you. uh, and thanks for being there, and thanks for accepting my request. We are eagerly waiting to this much awaited talk. Now the stage is all yours, Professor.
Thanks, Dr. Karmarkar. And I have to say, I loved Dr. Swati's interventions. I'm going to start. Thank you all for being there. And I'm looking at the other people who are sharing a virtual podium. I'm really excited to actually be the last speaker in this series that you've organized, amazing series you've organized, Dr. Karmarkar. But I want to say, I want to start very quickly because I actually do start with a journey. That Urdu has a bunch of travel narratives, and actually the idea of the rasta, the poetic, the rasta of shairi is a part of like a political understanding of what happens under colonialism and what you have to do. So you have to travel. And Dr. Jahan and Ismat Chugtai actually had amazing short stories in Urdu. So the genre doesn't take place in the novel; it takes place for women, especially women writers in local languages, in local languages, not in English, and it is actually very radical. You don't die, and nor do you go mad, but you do transform the world as you travel. So, and this starts certainly from the 1920s, some of it earlier, but definitely 1920s. And you've traveled with, anyway. So it got me thinking about topophilia. But I want to start with my story. And the first section, I start with fraud. 1829, Bibi Khanum decamped in Farrukhabad after an arduous journey with a pension roll for the man who'd adopted her son. The soldier, a Savar, had finally succumbed to a long, lingering illness, and she faced the unexpected. Her claim on his only inheritance, the pension he'd been guaranteed, was fraudulent. There at Farrukhabad, she realized to her surprise that the superintendent of family money decreed her husband's heir. One had to be picked, so an heir had to be picked like a winning hand at bridge from a roster of legitimate children, parents, brothers, sisters, and wife. This heir did not encompass her or her son. Neither of them was deemed legitimate. That was bad enough, but even worse, she was being charged with a false claim. The army had been trying to clamp down on pension swindlers, claimants armed with rolls that were supposedly not theirs to access. The viceroy had been trying to regulate who was allowed inheritances. Even appropriately adopted children could not, for example, leave their pensions to offspring that they had adopted. Adoption had to be followed by blood-bonded births for conveyances of property lived beyond a single lifetime. That the soldier had promised the Bibi support after his death didn't even make a dent in the intransigent facade of the clerical staff at the place where she'd arrived, expecting to access the very small stipend that would enable her to survive. The letters that the munshi she hired crafted for her in her pitiful attempts to garner sympathy from a network of disinterested officials elicited no compassion for her situation. She'd fallen outside the bounds of what came to be classified as family. None of her claims were valid. On the face of this, the story is both starkly simple and utterly complex. It speaks about someone assuming that she and her son would have unhampered access to the money they'd been promised, which had been left behind for them, that their inheritance was theirs to claim. They found instead a path so thorny, so labyrinthian, that searching their way through it seemed utterly insurmountable, as in fact it was. Something that was theirs had been snatched away, and rather than being welcomed, they were charged with fraud. The Bibi had been promised something, and she could not make good on that promise. The promise was made by an Indian in the East India Company Army. Those who were left to honor the promise were British. And in dishonoring it, the East India Company did not follow through on their pensionary promise to the Savar. Fairly straightforward, right? In a considerably more nuanced fashion, the story of Bibi Khanum alerts us to procedures of governance, of what scholars may think of a fiscal care economy, the intimate architecture of a colonial state supposedly committed in however bankrupt a fashion to benevolence, which I see actually as the genesis of welfare and welfare states. And this is not where most scholars put the genesis. It also bespeaks the production of family, determined through and in a kashmakash, a back and forth and tussle with finance. This last is the direction I want to take it for our purposes today: family, sexuality, and gender itself, and the ways in which economics and capital, and in this case, what I've coined life finance, finances that enable someone to stay alive, this is what I call life finance, come together with family, sexuality, and gender taken in their most nuanced sense. What do we come to see about family, sexuality, and gender if we root them through capital? And I'll return to what I intend by this observation further along in the talk. What I'd like to do today is literally to exhaust everything we can learn about how to do gender from this trifling, paltry example. Nobody really cared about the Bibi. She wasn't notable anyway. Nothing stood out about her. But that's the point I want to mine. It's in the trivial and the minor that we perhaps see most clearly the workings of gender and family. And that when we think gender and family, we need not just go to the big and profoundly disturbing things, such that numbers of women, trans folk, Dalit, Muslim, poor, migrants, rural workers, Santals, and Orans, for example, face. They face being left out of jobs, access to education and care. They live in a world whose entire social, political, and economic architecture is sketched out and mandated only for certain sorts of folk. It's through these profound forms of discrimination, and we believe them to be vital, that if we actually think about them, we understand the importance of changing our world. But in staying with these, the big things that call out to us so noisily, we miss out on how expectations that make this world so inhospitable, if not dangerous, to most of the people that live it. Expectations that infiltrate this world that we wish to change. These expectations are the collateral on the basis of which the world as we live it circulates, grows, makes itself over and over again. Let's go back to the histories that led our Bibi to forge her claim. By the 1770s, pensions that were graded by rank, handed out monthly, were a regular feature of the seduction into military recruitment for the East India Company armies. The company began to see that offering a pension as well as a salary would draw South Asians into its service, and something called a family pension, given only to a painstakingly culled, pitifully abbreviated roster of those who were deemed proper members of family congregations, had also been organized and set in place. Many of us who are used to a veritable circus of relatives, like I am, would be horrified to see how small this family was. The designated family in the pension family looked a lot like the Hum Do, Hamare Do of 1950s family planning ads. Along with the financial package, soldiers could be allotted a stretch of land called an invalid thana. Many of these were in Bengal, Bihar, and one of the regions set aside, signaled on a map for invalid pension property, was Purulia, where many of you teach, I think. And so coming back to our story, the Bibi was only one in a long tail of people who traipsed in an office to collect a pension. The tale of the Bibi was told to me by an elderly gentleman who asked me not to identify him, someone who was in the lineage of this Bibi Khanum's son. The story, my teller believes, seemed to revolve around differences in religion between the Bibi and the soldier who adopted the son. The soldier was Hindu, Bibi Muslim, and no one seemed to know if she'd actually married her Sawar. By then, as I noticed in the archives I consulted, and as the scholar Seema Alvi notes in her groundbreaking work on colonial armed forces, the British state decreed that if a child was adopted, it had to conform to the religion, Baradari, Jati of the person adopting them. Women were not permitted to adopt on their own cognizance, except through a man. And this was except in very carefully curated cases like the Begums of Bhopal. So they continued to be allowed to adopt until the 20th century. And these regulations organized inheritance, more especially the pensions given by the British company state. Inheritance was accompanied, in the case of those who worked for the colonizers, with a finely graded pension roll form. So there was a form that laid out an entire grammar of belonging: explicit name, religion, baradari, jati, region, language, gender, implicit sexuality, place of residence, information about parents. These were duly attested, and we know in India that in order to be valid, everything has to be attested by a phalanx of authorized persons. In the early 19th century, these included doctors, and not just lawyers and magistrates. As far as I can tell, the forms associated with pensions didn't have to be kept or recorded on stamp paper. And as we still have to, people were expected to turn themselves into authorities to prove that they were living. Wives had to show up with marriage documents. And we may want to see all these procedures as the beginning of a demand for the certification of self, gender, sexuality, and everything else to prove you were who you were. So why, you might ask yet again, am I going on about these circumstances that dog the Bibi's rather inconsequential life? What am I going to do with them? I'll reiterate several things. One, to ask questions about what gender might be. Two, to press against the idea of family, and to bring up both gender and family in a way that challenges some of the commonplace beliefs about both that we've come to assume or take for granted in the context of the state. To begin my foray, I want to lay out some provocations and take us through some of the theoretical roots and questions how to think about gender and sexuality have taken, and try to signpost and show us how our tale of the BB's woes shows up in many of the presumptions we hold. What we imagine in a sort of everyday way underwrites or collateralizes these presumptions about gender and sexuality. Who are you? Messing around with gender, intersections, and renditions. By now, whether all of you have encountered this or not, scholars are fully on board with the idea that gender is not as simple. That is, when we talk about gender, we also pull into its purview many other features of our lives. For scholars and activists in the US, this understanding began with the immortal words of, or attributed to, the escaped slave, activist, abolitionist Sojourner Truth, standing firm in 1851 against many other women at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, and asking the apocryphal and poignant question, ain't I a woman? This wasn't a simple question about ontology, the being of women in general. What Sojourner Truth raised her voice to was the assumption that gender was implicitly white, and in so being, she, a Black woman, wasn't deemed a woman at all. In the meantime, it was clear by then on our side of the world, in South Asia, that there was a stark distinction, and let's hold for the time being to the most bare-boned version of this between Indian women and British women, as we see in the work of many South Asian feminists, such as Kumari Jayawardena. And I work a lot in Sri Lanka as well. And it's interesting. I think many of you might find a lot of your questions answered if you go to Sinhala Tamil and English literature from Sri Lanka. This distinction between two different kinds of, Indian women and British women lay in how they were to be thought of, treated, spoken about, assumed to live. In other words, even by the early 19th century, we on the subcontinent could not just talk about gender in any banal fashion. Who one was as a woman, again, let's hold on to women as a simple category for the moment, was filtered through or constituted through, at the very least, the question of race. To turn again to Bibi Khanum, the child who was her son and the person who was the Sawar. It's likely, as my interlocutor suggested, that the Bibi didn't get the child's pension because of the difference between the religion she'd been accorded and that the Sawar had. I say accorded because there were many disputes in the early 19th century about what religion one was, and we could discuss this in the questions. So how the Bibi was treated was as a Muslim woman. This meshing may well have produced the responses to her. Now I want to bring up something else. I've been using the terms woman, man, son rather loosely. Let me explain. The Bibi was being treated as though she was a woman, as though she were a woman, and she may well have been living as one. So also for the two other protagonists in our stories. All of them may have been living as what the story narrated them as, a woman, son, man, but that says little about their biology. We don't, of course, know what the sexual inclinations of the Bibi were. Have many of you seen, I'm assuming a lot, at least if you haven't seen it, you know of it, the movie Der Ishkia. We don't even know whether she, the Bibi, was an ordinary she. After all, she could have been a trans woman. All we know about was that the Bibi had an offspring in tow, and the offspring had an adopted father who was just not its biological father, though who knows, right? And this father's colonially determined characteristics did not match up with his offspring's. Feminists call this the sex-gender distinction. Gender is one's social, political, economic being, and I'll return to these, and sex is one's biology. In our story, gender is produced through the narration. This is called gendering. In other words, there's nothing natural about gender. It comes to be under what Marxists call conditions of production. So we have a sense of how our characters live in the telling of them, but really know little or nothing about their biological being. And we can talk about this. There's lots of other stuff about this. So let's curve around again to what I said about the meshing of gender with race or religion. In 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black lawyer and critical race theorist, was trying to grapple with how and why women who came before the court, stood before the law, were treated. This is in the US. She wanted to understand how to explain dire disparities in treatment. Though Crenshaw says that what she called intersections to explain these disparities was not new, many feminists before her had come to the same kind of explanation for inequities as she had. She is the first person to coin the term intersections. Simply put, the only way you can understand how people are treated is by looking at them not through one axis of analysis, such as gender or such as race, but only if you begin to see them as racialized gendered subjects. That is, see race through a gendered lens and gender through a racialized lens. Once Crenshaw did this, she began to be able to see that the court made decisions about women on the basis of their race. White women, so women on the basis of their race. White women, for example, got the least onerous sentences. We just saw this in the case of the killing of the Dalit father and son in Tamil Nadu. Had they been Brahmin, their treatment would have been different. Here, it was not just that they were male, but the way in which masculinity and caste were conjoined led to their killing. So the intersection of race and gender and class, at the minimum, will give you some cues to seeing how someone may be handled. The image Crenshaw used was a traffic intersection, where you are the person at the center of a chaurasta, a square, where four roads meet and are composed of all the axes of belonging or identifications. I used this image myself with a group that I worked with in the 1990s called Women Against Racism for all our community workshops. And we did workshops in cities, villages, unions, colleges, inner cities. And to speak about what people face. But this is often how we come to view people. We look at them not merely as women or trans subjects, but our responses to them, even in an everyday way, are organized through many facets: class, region, language, caste, religion, urban or rural, migrant or not, all taken together. These facets contribute to structural inequalities and the ways in which access to jobs, money, and various forms of capital are given or denied people. Now, Kath Weston, who's an anthropologist and theorist of sexuality, in fact, she wrote the first book on queer families called Families We Choose, was taught in a lot of sociology departments in India, because it started new kinship studies, something we call new kinship studies. But she's also a scholar of the environment. She's done a book, she's written a lot of books, but she's also written on environment, refined Crenshaw's formulation somewhat by coining another term, renditions. Weston was interviewing in queer communities composed of people of different races, classes, who spoke different languages and such. Weston found out that often what people face or how people are seen is not through everything that may make up who they are. So in other words, this whole cluster of everything. But the ways in which different facets combine or show up is often an outcome of the particular circumstances into which they've been landed or based on what they're facing. So here's the difference between intersections and renditions. An intersectional analysis takes every characteristic of a person together every time we analyze someone, or analyze, especially in relation to the circumstances they face. Renditions allow us to feature some aspects more clearly. Some facets are highlighted, while others drop away from view based on the state of affairs in which a person finds themselves. In our case, the Bibi was not just treated as a woman, but it was as a Muslim woman that she found herself without a pension. And not just that, but as somebody who probably showed up at the superintendent of family money, the pension officer's domicile, without a birth certificate. And in claiming the pension of someone rather low in the army hierarchy, a Sawar, she probably had a dearth of social or economic capital. So in her case, it was religion and gender and status, as probably married or unmarried, her lack of access to social value and economic value, aka poor, that played into the refusals of her access to financial capital, her pension, the kind of capital her pension would have afforded her. She obviously didn't know a bunch of people who could grease the wheel, so to speak, to help her. The Bibi may or may not have been a poet. She may or may not have been trans. She may or may not have been rural or urban in upbringing. We don't know her caste. Yes, many Muslims do obey the protocols of Jati or Varna caste, and at the very least, certainly for UP, northern Muslims, Sharafat plays into how social capital is allocated, doled out, and taken for granted as one's own without a smidgen of hesitation. We don't know what the BB's cost was. We don't know many of these things, but for our purposes, none of these things came into play in the rigmarole and repeatedly unsympathetic verdict pronounced on the Sawar's pension. This, that is, gender meshed in religion folded into their modest means, both for the Sawar and the BB, with not even a suggestion of marriage certificate, is what Weston would call a particular rendition of the BB. I think Weston's fashioning of rendition is handy to think with. And let's expand our brief vignette a bit as a thought experiment so you can get a better sense of how renditions might work. Assume, for example, the BB goes to a local mosque for Jummah prayers. Then what would be noticeable about her and her influence, where she might lay out her prayer mat, and kneel would be her gender, not the fact she was Muslim, although it would be as a Muslim that she went to pray along with other men and women of every age. Her class wouldn't matter at all. So in other words, in those circumstances, it would be her gender that would organize space for her, right? Not the fact that she was Muslim. And class ought not to matter, but sometimes it does. And class ought not to matter because of the conditions of prayer in a mosque. Quick sidebar on capital. When people think of the word capital or think with the word capital, we usually use it in the ways in which the philosopher Karl Marx made so common, as a term whose sense lies in the economic. However, as you can see, I'm deploying it more capaciously in the way in which Pierre Bourdieu did, a French sociologist and a Marxist like many of his compatriots at the time, who grew up with not many financial resources at his disposal. Bourdieu saw that even some who were like him seemed to be able to claim resources because of who they knew, social capital, or whether they were thought of as especially pious, religious capital, or were endowed with a remarkable ability to play an instrument, say, and their uncle knew a music teacher, cultural and social capital combined. And so they were given prestige or became famous, acquired symbolic capital. They may or may not have had any money, or they may not have had any money at all. So little economic capital at their disposal, but their way in the world was greased and eased because they could assemble, avail of, marshal, and deploy these other forms of capital. So, how are you? Warrants and the economies of gendering. How do you become who you are? The next confabulation our vignette leads us to is how we orient the place of documentation. The BB tucked a piece of documentation called the pension roll into a potli. Without it, she probably wouldn't even have the thumb been emboldened enough to go off and lay a claim for a pension before a clearly uncaring official. We don't know how far our BB had to travel, how arduous her journey might have been. We do know from the archives that the people traveled good long distances to be given their monthly pensions, and people still do this. They traipse off into the state or the city in which the pensions have been hosted when it's time to retrieve the money. But be that as it may, we commonly see documents such as the pension roll in the following fashion, as something that accompanies us when we harry a claim on something. An Aadhaar card put forward, for example, to open a bank account. It's something a person pulls out, a piece of paper, lays before a concerned authority as proof of identity. And here we can include life insurance forms, the Pehchan Patra, the voting card, passport, birth certificate. What I want to do today is ask the question, what if we flip this around and reoriented how we think about what documents do? Not as something that supposedly proves identity, but actually makes ourselves an identity. The trans theorist, founder of transgender studies and cyber studies, mother computer hacker Alakiri Roseanne Stone, aka Sandy Stone, writing in the early 1990s, called this warranting, and accompanied warranting with what she also coined as a fiduciary subject, garnering her sense of it from Kobina Mercer, the African-American queer photographer's idea of the culturally intelligible body. What does it mean? How do these particular insights serve our purposes today? Stone uses the designation of biosocial to massage culturally intelligible. For Sandy Stone, warranting gives us leverage on our sense of ourselves, how we are, who we are in the world, and how this sense of ourselves and who we are in the world was constituted. What is a warrant? In India, we go along with summonses or a variety of documents sent out to police to be written up by the police, which gives them permission to produce the person in order to arrest them. We're very familiar with this. What Sandy Stone arrived at by routing her questions through breaking down how cyberspace works. And actually, she's thought of warranting not just through the idea of the police warrant, but cyberspace, what it allows, what virtual space allows, and through a deep understanding of herself as a trans person and with a child was this. It's not just that the body shows up holding a piece of paper to attest to who it is. Rather, the piece of paper makes the body. The piece of paper is prior to the body. The body is formatted, lives, is conceived, even perhaps understood by itself, or imagines a very, very different sense of who it might be, because the paper pushes bodies in a particular direction when it's pulled out to produce the body before the piece of paper. Witness your birth certificate. In my example, when I was born, it had caste on it. I don't know if they still do. Gender, father and mother's name. I became the person to a very great extent to conform what was written onto my birth certificate. Unlike most Indians, my parents, one Gujarati, one mixed up Punjabi, her family is married into Gujars, Malayalis, Himachalis, UP Walas, wrote Indian under caste. So my caste, my family actually chose to make my caste Indian, and female under gender. I lived then in biosomatic designations that orchestrated my being. This is Stone's fiduciary subject and Mercer's culturally intelligible body. In my own recent book, Risky Bodies and Techno-Intimacy, following upon Stone, I treat paper or virtual identification procedures as forms of technology that produce not just the body, but the socially, politically, economically viable subject. What Stone would see as a textually mediated physicality, a legible body, a body that's legible to the state, a socially apprehensible subject. In the BB's case, a colonial denizen. In our case, a citizen. And I continued, I'm quoting Stone, the production and maintenance of this link between a discursive, which is the piece of paper, and physical space, the pension roll, the Aadhaar card, is what Stone calls warranting. To turn to Stone again, she says, by means of the procedures of warranting, the political apparatus of government is able to guarantee the production of what will be called a citizen. We understand that very clearly in South Asia right now. I continue to quote, the meaning associated with the physical body is produced by the production of texts, by the means of text, such as legal, medical, and psychological description. She says that because so much of an identity is discursive and produced through the action of texts, I have elsewhere referred it to a legible body, that is, a textually mediated physicality. In other words, your physicality is made comprehensible or legible through the text. The legible body, Stone goes on to say, displays the social meaning of body on its surface, presenting a set of cultural codes that organize the way the body is apprehended and that determine the range of socially appropriate responses. To recount it again, a simple way of thinking about this is that when a policeman knocks on your door with a warrant, a person is expected to be produced. In other words, the warrant actually becomes the form through which a body is constituted. The warrant produces a body before it. Warranting then produces this body as the fiduciary subject. And, we can continue to talk about it. It's fairly complicated. So in closing, to return to the BB for our final analytical nugget, Michael Foucault, the philosopher, historian, queer theorist, calls this what Sandy Stone is talking about, biopower. And let's think a little bit about biopower. In other words, when we think about biopower, one of the things that Foucault gets us to think about is the state generates a huge volume of data on people by putting them in categories that then go on to organize who they are and what's done to them. Data is collected by census forms, insurance forms, forms you fill out. But what is curious about this data is that the questions themselves are generative of what is collected. And it's through them that what is done to enable people to live, it's through them, that what is done to people to enable people to live is designed by the state. So for Foucault, the formulation in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, is the way in which we understand this, the new state post the 1700s, is this sort of double sense of make live and let die. So some people are made to live, and they're made to live through a bunch of procedures that are formulated through the collection of data, and they're allowed to die. And we understand this very, very clearly right now, I think, throughout the world. And so, but let me show you what I mean in the case of our Bibi. Bibi Khanum had a pension roll in her hand. It's no accident that the East India Company may have been arguably said to administer the first large-scale censuses and said to sketch out identification forms and procedures for producing identity. By the time the Bibi was looking out for herself and her ability to stay alive by heading off to claim a pension, these identification forms had been well established in the form of a pension form that was filled out. So it's literally identification. Pension forms became a form of identification. When they were initially filled in, these forms seemed to generate enormous amounts of confusion, according to the hapless officials who were put in charge of getting the forms completed. People didn't understand what officials meant by caste. Some people actually struggled to define themselves as either Hindu or Muslim, male or female. Officials helped them into various categories, and then these categories defined who the person was. Once the form was filled out, the people appeared as it, thought of themselves through those categories, had to present themselves in these categories. In other words, they came to be through intersections or renditions. Warranting is the process by which this discursive, category-bound entity is also tied to one and only one particular body. So that's one other thing that Sandy Stone wants us to think about when we think about warranting. This procedure produces a fiduciary subject, and that process, which secures a discursive self as a single self to a body. So the procedure is discursive self is a single self attached to a body and produced as a body. According to Stone, that process is always political. The Bibi's pension roll also set her up with a putative sexuality. I've coined this idea of sexuality as heteropropriety. I prefer not to use heterosexuality because certainly in South Asia, we don't necessarily know whether somebody with a kid in tow may or may not be hetero in the usual desiring inclinations, but they may lay claim, as our Bibi did, to a pension. And in doing so, in claiming capital through a man, she became putatively or effectively hetero. The term propriety attached to hetero plays with and amalgamates both proper and property. The property the Bibi has come to claim under the effective claim of being attached to a man. This then is how I view techno-intimacy. The intimacies with a particular self and with members who were designated as appropriate inheritors and therefore a proper family. So these are intimacies with a particular self and with the members who are produced and designated as appropriate inheritors and therefore designated as a proper family. These intimacies were produced and established through the pension roll. The paper pension roll becomes a genre of technology that brings the self as intimate with oneself and the family into being. Whether or not she got the payout, and we know she didn't, and whether or not the Bibi story was true or just a tragic piece of apocrypha to vindicate their current circumstances that her family still told at least 150 years after she supposedly tried to access a pension, the story is one that enables us to see much of value. It gives us a sense of the historical exigencies that led us to be where we are. where we still need identification documents that warrant us and so produce us as fiduciary subjects, to produce our self and worth simultaneously, where the idea of sanctioned families had come to be inaugurated and accepted only if each participant shared religion and varna, jati, baradari, family collapsed. This is the idea of family collapsed into blood, and the most constricted notion of belonging together and squeezing out so many who care for our beings, where we are constituted as composed as fraudulent subjects more easily than we are believed to be true and honest citizens, where class, jati, varna, baradari folded into other features which are orchestrated through either intersections or renditions. These orchestrate who we are and what we can avail, how we are seen, the nuances of discrimination we face, the resources at our disposal. I thank you for paying attention to it's not very complicated, but I've pushed all
Thanks,
a bunch of theory. So
yes, yes. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this wonderful presentation. And the comment box is flooded, ma'am, with a lot of wonderful comments and kind words. And 2-3 questions are there. Let me take.
So can I say one thing? If I don't get to all the questions, feel free to actually send them an email, and I'll respond in email to them. I'll make a sheet and then respond to them. So
Yes, I will send them your mail ID. Okay, they are also asking for that. There is a question that what kind of body is legible to state, and how can we connect consciousness and politics while understanding techno intimacy?
Very good. So the one of the interesting things is I want to flip it around. We think of the idea of the state and the body, and I think this, trying to work it out as two separate things, right? The kinds of body that are legible to the state are the sorts of bodies that actually the state produces as legible. So it's a very strange paradox. In other words, at this point, for example, the state is making trans bodies legible, certain kinds of trans bodies legible to the state. But as trans folk know, the way in which trans bodies are legible to the state actually are very constrained and restricted, and getting more and more so, right? So literally the state produces the sort of trans body that's legible to it. And for those of you who work in trans politics, and I actually have been working in trans politics since the 1970s, interestingly enough, that actually a lot of the way in which, and certainly the early stuff on transgender in South Asia, which was done by white anthropologists, really dreadful, actually imagined that all trans bodies were kind of Hindu, simple notions of Hindu, right? So part of it was an idea of how she thought the state, her idea, literally, so on paper, she constituted the trans body as Hindu. So in fact, trans bodies who were not Hindu were not legible as trans at all to her, right? So so that's what I want us to think about. And you're thinking about consciousness and politics. So the question is, I would ask you, and techno intimacy, I would ask you to think with me about what you mean by consciousness. So I'm going to throw the question back at you. Do you mean somebody who has a sense of the political? Do you mean consciousness in the more generic philosophical sense? Do you mean political consciousness? And I think for me, techno-intimacy actually allows you, so one of the things that techno-intimacy allows you to do is begin to answer the question, the first part of your question, right? So once you begin to understand how bodies are constituted in this form, literally, so you become, and Sandy Stone is a really interesting person to read, so go back and read her early work, The Empire Strikes Back. It's really, really good. because what she's trying to work out is, once you get absorbed into your own idea of self, and you might want to call that consciousness, through this notion of what the kind of body that the state asks you to produce, that also begins to organize your politics, right? In certain ways. And in some ways, in writing a letter, Rohit Vemula asked us to he used the idea of the piece of paper to reformat how we thought the political body, right? So I'd say it's really important to go back to how we constitute ourselves through the forms that the state has given us. And actually, if you begin to unsuture those forms, you actually begin to get to a really strong politics. And I think there are a lot of people, and many of you, I'm sure, are doing exactly that right now in South Asia.
Is gender an existential category? How is authentic choice to be understood in terms of gender in India?
So one of the things I'd say is, having taught this, I've been teaching stuff on gender and sexuality a long time, right? I've also been doing political work a long time. So basically, I was in the emergency in India, started thinking about gender and sexuality then. So let's actually think about the idea of choice, right? So one of the things about choice is when choice itself is a part of a neoliberal organization, right? Choice is a particularly neoliberal word. So one of the things I'm asking you to do, and I actually do entire classes on how we are sold to the notion of choice. A good person to go back and read is The Prison Notebooks and Antonio Gramsci. It goes back to his idea of hegemony. So I want us to understand that choice itself is a politically and economically determined notion of agency and freedom, right? So we don't make a simple choice about gender. We learn to navigate the shoals, very difficult shoals, through which we have been produced or constituted. And again, a good person to go to is Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter, right? So it's through the repetition, or if you want a general philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, I can give you other names, but it's through the repetition of gender and sexuality, through the repeated formulations. And Cath Weston takes Butler to a political economy, through the demands of political economy, that we're constituted. Once you begin to understand the nuances of what the conditions of constitution are, you can actually begin to navigate through them in different ways, right? And I don't think, if you begin to think choice, you think of yourself as this sort of subject that's standing outside all the ways in which you're constituted, and imagining you can pick and choose from a bunch of commodity comestibles, right? That's not the theorists of gender and sexuality. And in fact, I think lots of South Asians actually understand this really clearly, right? You can do jugaad, which is the closest thing we come to, perhaps,
Yes.
to rethink how we live.
Ma'am, how many questions can I take more? You just tell me.
We have, each question is like an entire portly with a big fat question portly. So I think, I don't know, do one or two and then send me the rest.
Okay. Then I am taking 2 more questions.
Okay.
Okay. And ma'am, if you can tell it in a precise way, then I can take 2-3 questions more.
Yeah, it's very hard because the questions are big ones, right? So they're not asking like X or Y, you're asking a kind of explanation for the world. But anyway, let me try.
Okay. Then there is another question that you said about birth certificates is not the very first document which categorize our normative identity. as we have to mention gender name there also. So how can we change this thing as it is a document mandatory for everyone?
So the question, so one of the things, very quickly, don't use the word normative, okay? And I'll obviously have to send a whole reading list. So that's got a long history. So basically, so the question is really to, I mean, I can't answer that question. You guys can, with me, right? For one, maybe not ask for a birth certificate. Why do you need a birth certificate? What makes a birth certificate mandatory? Let's ask. So what would have everybody ask is, lots of people live without a birth certificate. My father doesn't have one, right? So, you know, I mean, it wasn't mandatory. The British made it more and more. The Indian state made it even more mandatory. So what would it mean to actually say we don't need one? Can we think about other ways? What would it mean to say we don't need to validate the fact that we are who we are? We are who we are. So I'm, you know, throwing that back as a political question to all of you. Come up with some answers and send them.
Yes. And then how does one read Foucaultian notion of biopower and state-enabled identity via identities of resistance?
So via identities of resistance.
Vis-a-vis identities of resistance.
So one of the things that actually Foucault does, it's very interesting, right? So when he's thinking about biopower, he's thinking about power. So this is big fat question, unfortunately, because he's reviewing the idea of power. We're interested in, we think in terms of power. When we think about power, we think of the danda, right? The state standing above us. We think of, and that's a idea of power that comes from the notion of the king, right? Standing over us. Foucault's notion of biopower is very different. And it's what he calls capillary power. I don't know, I'm going to try and finish this in a minute. I don't know if I can, which is actually power runs around every single thing we do, right? And for Foucault, power and resistance always go together. So the question is to actually understand the way that power runs through everything, see it literally, live it, and then in the living, understand the forms of resistance. So we're used to power is X, the danda does X, and then the response will be to counteract the danda. He's saying power runs through absolutely everything. It's like a capillary system. And so resistance is also a capillary system. So the ways in which we change is often in minute shifts, right? And that's up to you as a person or a group, right? Little ways. Like refusing the birth certificate. Lots of people don't have birth certificates. And it's a very interesting, I've done a whole bunch of interviews tracking Aadhaar cards to see how people transform, what they do if they don't have a birth certificate.
Yes, that is.
We can do another one if you want, but I don't know. How are you doing? Because if you Gautam, you should say something too.
At the same time, regarding certificate and all, but before that, said it to some extent right that from the very beginning it should begin at home, and it can be a kind of learned behavior, and when we are talking about biopower and when we are talking about Foucault, then every time to some extent the oppressive section are under some kind of control, some kind of authority is controlling there. It's about like that
So-
kind of analogy of panopticon, and where state mechanism is there, school, colleges, authorities. It's about ideological state apparatus and at the same time repressive state apparatus. All are there to make us feel that yes, we are constantly under some kind of monitoring is there, some kind of camera is always there. It's like that we are living in the house of Big Brother, to some extent, ma'am.
So Foucault takes the panopticon a certain way, right?
Yes,
But he doesn't. So basically, the panopticon is where he starts. He wants to move away, wants to get us to rethink power from the idea of the danda, right? So the
Yes,
way he
yes.
gets us to power, a different notion of power, is going through the panopticon. Jeremy
Yes.
Bentham, and in fact, the one most perfect panopticon prison is on Andaman's Island, right? It's one of the most perfect panopticons. It's worth going just to see that. And from Bengal, people go, right?
Yes.
So go see the Andaman's prison. Now, Foucault went beyond the panopticon. So, and remember that all these guys were writing at the same time. You have Althusser, you have Foucault, you have a bunch of people really thinking about the question of how do you think of power, right? Althusser writes after Gramsci, right? And Gramsci's notion of power is like, so Althusser, so you're trying to think a bunch of different things. You're thinking about ideological state apparatuses in the way and being hailed, right? In terms of Louis Althusser. Foucault did, so Althusser does about, like he sort of organizes things in a much more schematic fashion than Foucault does. So Foucault, in some ways, works with the idea of the ideological state apparatus to do something else. He moves away from control to a kind of form of insinuation, right? It's a different, so basically, and control actually, you can have control, but in a really complicated way. So the question is, when you go, so Foucault actually thinks about power and knowledge together, right? So it's not just you have knowledge and knowledge controls you. You are part of the production of knowledge. There's a kind of what he calls a matrix, right? So if you go back to the history of sexuality, or I don't know, you go back to the interviews in Power Knowledge, those are actually more interesting to read in some ways. You realize that this matrix, you're sort of live in a kind of series of overlapping matrices, as you said, the school, the hospital, the house, the domestic space, the outside space, the university, right? The public park, right? And in all of these, there are authorities that are designated as actually having the ability, or they're given the right to produce knowledge from us, right? In that production of knowledge is the way in which power works, right? So in that production of knowledge, so one of the interesting things to do is to, like, when somebody asks you a question, a doctor asks you a question about your health, right? You think it's actually giving you something good, but it's also in some ways part of the mechanism of what Foucault calls, sort of the confession, right? So you're constantly confession. You're doing it to your teachers. You're doing it on exam. You're going to be giving the students questions, right? So in some ways, you become the person who's actually producing knowledge through the form of the question, right? So that's more complicated. And you actually then, Althusser's notion of ideological state apparatuses. And in some ways, that actually, in that way, power becomes capillary. What would it mean for you to basically lie to the doctor?
Yes.
Right? So actually, in some ways, that becomes a form of resistance.
Ma'am, can we, in this context, also we can understand the concept of docile body, because these bodies are basically become docile under some kind of power when power operates there.
So no, actually, there is no such thing for Foucault as a docile body, right? Everybody's active. Activity isn't agency, right? So I mean, there are bodies that are, so when we think, for Foucault, the body is constituted, right? So when we think docile bodies, it's the counterpoint to thinking the king on a throne, right? You have a king on a throne, you have a body in front of it, and it's like you're doing a sajda, right? Or being. So Foucault's notion of power goes away from this idea of the throne. I mean, remember, he's trying to understand how power operates in the ways it does in what we call a democratic state, right? It's not a state with a king. It's not a state with a danda. Although people can get beaten. Now that the danda and beating are two different things, right? And it's important to understand that, right? So, he's not thinking docile bodies. Everybody participates in, and I think it's really important. This is part of the reason I did the work on techno-intimacy, and I've done a bunch of stuff on insurance and risk, is everybody participates in the production of knowledge, because part of the idea of the production of knowledge itself is it's organized around self-care, right? And in that way, Foucault's panopticon is not just you being watched by other people, but in fact, you watching yourself.
That is. Ma'am, when ma'am, in this, but not in this context, ma'am, but at the same time, ma'am, when during the course of this whole FDP, I've come across the fact that yes, when women are also resisting to some extent, they have also become self-empowered. In this context, I can relate it to Elizabeth Broad's concept of volatile body, where she also criticizes Foucault, and at the same time, she also criticizes delusion, and she talks that yes, they talk about only the male body and to some extent about that docility, but it is the docility which gives birth to at the same time volatility. It means there must be some kind of resistance, and Foucault himself tells that where there is a power, there is also resistance.
Right. So I think Elizabeth actually does some interesting things with volatile body, right? Because actually, but in some ways, I think, it's too easy, because basically in some ways she's doing a Foucauldian analysis, right? And I think it's, at some point it became like, and she's somebody who reads everything, right? So, but it became too easy to critique Foucault. He was like the hitman for everybody, right? So actually, I think she takes Foucault and in volatile bodies does something in addition to it, right? Foucault, actually, if you take him and think about the idea of the production of gender itself, gender is constituted, and gender actually, it's really, it's interesting to think with, right? So rather than, in some ways, Foucault gets us to think the idea of the fiduciary subject. And I think, if we the fiduciary subject, the question I'd ask is fiduciary subject a volatile subject, right? Is Sandy Stone, I wish Elizabeth had read Sandy Stone. I don't know what she would have quite done with Stone. But a lot of people actually, because she was a trans theorist, right?
Yes.
So they didn't actually treat her, and her writing is very deliberately refuses the conventions, much more than Elizabeth's writing does. It's much more. That's much more.
Yes, ma'am. In this context, can you please also elaborate a bit about Claire Colebrook when she's talking about corporal feminism also to some extent?
Well,
can you relate?
Yeah, no. So tell me what you think about the corporal feminism.
No, while I was reading that Colebrook, and she is also to some extent, she is also telling what other feminists has talked about body from that bodily perspective, about that gender, about the kind of oppression they are taking. So I find it nothing new about it. Do you agree with it?
Yeah, I agree that it's nothing new. Partly, if you actually, I think that returning, I mean, in some ways, it depends on how you return to the body.
Yes.
I don't think, the question is not returning to the body per se. The question is, what body are you returning to?
Yes.
And I mean, it would be interesting, again, like what I would say to both Elizabeth and Colebrook. It'd be very interesting to look at some of the Native American work on the idea of paper identity. And there's Eva Marie Garut. I mean, again, I can send you. I work a lot with the work of Native American scholars, indigenous scholars in the U.S. And there's a different. I mean, in some ways, some of the vital things like vital matters, the idea of the vitality of the world, right? Which actually doesn't give enough credence to a notion of living world is more interesting than some of the more foreshortened notions of corporeality,
Yes. Ma'am, now as we are heading towards almost, we are going to
Late for
finish.
you.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am. I think, ma'am, I also do think that it's a kind of gender sensitization. Is a kind of basic requirement to understand the sensitive needs of a particular gender.
Mm-hmm.
Ma'am, and ma'am, it also can help us to examine our personal attitudes and beliefs and can question the realities that we thought we know. And ma'am, I
Yeah.
think that the need for this kind of sensitivity has been felt and realized through times immemorial and in almost all kinds of human existence across the globe. So we need to throw light on how to sensitize to those gender issues at first at home and then on campus, as many people believe that education is the catalyst for change, and educational space also instill thought and make one have a perception that they believe.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, ma'am, in this way.
No, it's absolutely true. And I'll say one thing, because I've been working on disability rights for a very long time. And one of the things, that we often imagine that you're going to change by changing something, right? What I asked you to, the part of my talk was organized, and I write a lot to think about change, because I've been actually dealing with institutional change for a long time, is to actually change the entire world. So basically, I think the last speaker actually began to get us to think about that in a certain way, which is the world is organized to be hospitable to a certain paper-produced body, right? And what happens if you turn that around and actually make it inhospitable to that paper-produced body, right? So, for example, I can't always walk upstairs, and I'm often asked to stand on a podium, right? So the entire architecture that we live in is organized to give certain people an advantage. What if you change the architecture around? And I mean, in some ways, architecture produces the people who live in it with a sense of comfort. And my talk was organized to make everybody think about, okay, how do I assume, what is the kind of self that's produced that I feel comfortable in, and how is the world enabling this, right? And how do I let go of that and make a world that is uncomfortable to me?
Yes. So, ma'am, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk, ma'am. And yes, there is nothing more to say to you. And I would like to thank you for talking with us about this unsung area. And I truly appreciate all the time and care you took in telling us all this. We know how busy you are, and so we are grateful that you take time to prepare it and spend a beautiful evening and a beautiful morning with us. Our audience was intrigued by the new possibilities for global research And we truly are becoming, I think, interdisciplinary scholars day by day. And this kind of talk will certainly lead us to be one such. And several in the group have expressed their appreciation for the information you presented on certain gender issues. And they are looking at ways that we might implement some of your suggestions also. The consensus is that they would like you to talk again, and I hope you will consent to speak to us again, perhaps sometime. And I would like to personally thank you for a wonderful presentation. And judging from the comments of those who attended, the FDP seems to be very successful. Most of the credit goes to you and the others who gave such interesting presentations. Thanks for being there.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
I thank you for inviting me. And I write, I compose. So it took me, it took me a fair amount of time to write this. So,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
I'm
Yes,
really
ma'am.
happy that people got something from it, you know.
Ma'am,
So thank
thanks,
you.
ma'am. Thanks a lot also, ma'am, for sending me the questions. I know that it sometimes become extremely tough, and I
Mhm.
also tell you uh, perhaps on the 11th hour. So forgive me also,
Don't
and
worry.
ma'am, thanks a lot for your constant support throughout the
Oh,
FDP.
a
I'm
pleasure.
extremely grateful to you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Karmakar. It's you're doing really good work. So, and I'm happy to have done this. Very happy to have done this. So, thank you everybody for attending.
Okay, thanks. So now I am thanks. Ma'am. Now I am heading towards the final vote of thanks. So, Honorable Principal C.K. Panda and Mrs. Sirupam Mahalanabis, HOD of the Department of English, and our most valued invited speakers, all the listeners, participants. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this wonderful occasion. And I cannot thank everyone enough for their involvement and their willingness to take on the completion of tasks beyond their comfort zone. So I, on behalf of Barabazar Bikram Tudu Memorial College, affiliated to Sidhu Kanhu Vishwa University, and the entire team working behind this platform, that I am only there. Let me call it fraternity of interdisciplinary studies here together. Now we have to sensitize our mind, sensitize our thought, and we have to think and our own behalf. And I extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all invited speakers for gracing your important work and sharing with us your findings and opinion for these 7 days. Thanks a lot.
Thank
And
you.
thanks a lot, man. Hope to work with you in future, man. Thanks a lot, man. Thanks. So I have shared everything, and it's time to say you good night. So we have to do certain modification of behavior. We have to behave in a manner which is sensitive to gender justice. We have to change behavior, and we have to instill empathy. We have to help people in examining their personal attitudes, and we need to act against sexual harassment at home, at workplace, and everywhere. So I guess this FDP proves to be a successful one. Good night. Stay safe. Stay sound and healthy. Stay at home, and hope we'll again join someday somewhere. And I am requesting you all not to leave that Telegram group, because very soon I am going to organize another program. So be there. And those who want to get connected with me, they can also send me friend request, and they can also send me their text on WhatsApp also. Often I used to see Telegram. So thanks a lot. I have already shared this link. You all have to submit today's assignment link. You all have to submit today's assignment playing time, and again I am telling you, thanks a lot. Goodbye. And I will send the certificates to those who have completed 5 assignments. Okay. I have already shared the link several times in this YouTube chat box. I have posted the links now for 20 times in this YouTube chat box, so there is no issue that you won't be able to find it. Sharing time and again. Thanks. I am still sharing so that you all can get benefited. Thanks.